Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual and our conversation series, which we halted during the election campaign. We're delighted to have as our guest tonight Raghuram Rajan, one of the world's leading financial economists. Currently a professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. His career includes chief economist at the IMF in Washington, where he famously warned of the 2008 financial crisis way back in 2005. He is also chief economist at the IMF in Washington, and he was chief economic advisor to the Indian government and then governor of the Reserve Bank of India for 4 years. He is the author of many books, and I'm going to touch on a few of those today. Raghu, welcome to South Africa. It's a real privilege to have you with us, and a long time since you and I were on a panel together in Delhi on development and democracy. So it's great to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me jump right in with the question I'm sure you're asked often. China and India are often compared to one another. Why was China so successful in using low-cost manufacturing to move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty compared to India? India's share of the global garment trade has declined by over 20% since 2015, while Bangladesh and Vietnam are surging ahead in this area. So why is India not competitive? And why is export-led industrialization so hard for India to get going on scale?
Great question. So first, thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be with your listeners. India and China are similar in that they're two extremely large countries. The Indian population is about 1.4 billion, slightly more than China, which is in the process of shrinking after its one-child policy. What China did that India didn't early on in its development path was it focused on education. It had, for whatever reason, maybe it was communist ideology working better than democracy, in pushing it to give its people a strong education. By the time China liberalized in the early 1980s, the years of education amongst its people was significantly higher than democratic India. India had not spent the time focusing on education, partly because there wasn't as much demand given it was a more rural economy, and there was no ideological reason to push education. But also, perhaps the weight of the caste system, why educate people beyond their natural functions. This is an idea that Myron Wiener at MIT used to be very, very forceful on. Whatever the reason, India started really focusing on education as it liberalized its economy, and the demand for higher qualified workers increased. But that was much later than China. So at the point of liberalization, China had far more workers who were capable of doing factory jobs. You need some numeracy, some ability to read in order to do even low-skilled jobs. But more important, it also allowed them, as Yasheng Huang at MIT says, allowed them to break off and do small enterprises, given the technical knowledge they had picked up in their factories. And that led to an explosion of Chinese entrepreneurship, small manufacturing entrepreneurs, town and village enterprises, for example, across the board. Two other things that I think were important for China. One was that China, in practice, was far more decentralized in policies than India. You had local governments basically run by party functionaries who wanted to rise up the party's hierarchy by, enhancing growth. And that means that they were willing to waive rules, overlook regulations, so long as it favored the local champions. It was a very tailored kind of regulation. If you look at Chinese regulations, it's, like India, horrendously business unfriendly. But they waived the appropriate ones to enable local growth. India, on the other hand, doesn't have decentralized empowerment. And that meant the rules set at the center or the state capital applied everywhere, which was often a burden in terms of, like South Africa, we have very strong British genes in how bureaucratic we are, and it doesn't work well. I think the third factor, which was important, was China was not democratic. India was. And so China could ignore the niceties of democracy, plant its railways where it wanted, take land where it needed, and suppress market forces. Unions, for example, bargaining more strongly for wages. China kept wage growth below productivity growth for a long time. That benefited firms, that created, in the longer run, many more jobs, more competitive firms, and actually higher paying jobs in the long run. But in the short run, the price was paid by the workers. Similarly, with bank deposits kept at a really low rate so that you could give cheap capital to the firms. Now, none of this could be done in India, where a strident, vocal, middle class protested for rights. Now, none of this is to say this is the path India should take, but it is history. And it is why India fell back in manufacturing. Today, which is the issue you raised, there are a bunch of other factors which prevent countries from following that manufacturing-led exports path, though Vietnam is doing a pretty good job there. But for the most part, one problem is China is still there. China hasn't exited low and moderate skilled manufacturing. Yes, companies are looking for a China plus one strategy, but that's only at the margin. The bulk of production is still done in China. And even the China plus one strategy typically involves assembly of inputs brought in from China. So there is some way to go. China is still there. It hasn't vacated manufacturing. And of course, there's the very high levels of protectionism that are emerging across the world as countries worry about what happened to them as a result of the China shock. And it is, very hard for a country of India's size to become another China because there is much less space there. So manufacturing is harder. It's not impossible, as Vietnam suggests, but you're competing not so much with the rich country worker anymore. You're competing with China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. So your competitive advantage in having cheap labor is no longer such an advantage. And as I said, the Indian worker has only recently come up to the capabilities of workers elsewhere.
That's a really interesting answer, different from what I was expecting in some ways. Chinese wages have gone down, have gone up, of course, quite dramatically. So that is a space, but the size of India, it's not. It's very different from a country like South Africa of 62 million to find space. Let me move to where you ended, which is your new book called Breaking the Mold: India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity. I suppose you raise a lot of important issues. How does India grow rich before it becomes old is the big issue. And you and your co-author are making an argument in this book for India to adopt a new approach from many other developing countries to growth. And that's one led by services. You say that the world has changed. India has enabled a whole new set of activities which Japan never had, China never had, but India has. The country needs a new model for growth. Can you talk to us about this new model for growth and why you think it's so important now?
Right. So let me first answer a point you made, which is Chinese wages are increasing, but China also productivity is increasing because it's investing a huge amount of capital in its workers. And so, productivity adjusted, it's not clear China is any less competitive. And it still has workers in its western provinces. It's drawing in to the away from agriculture. So there is still some way to go before China is forced to go up the skill scale, as you correctly sort of point to, but it will take time. Um, uh, Let me start by saying, by emphasizing what I'm not saying. I think the mistake that countries like India have made in the past, and this is meant as a broader sort of roadmap for countries in Africa, in Latin America, which still have to go down the path of middle income and beyond. Uh, the mistake is to say, this is the industry we're going to succeed in, and pick those industries to focus on. Interestingly, some of the most successful industries in India's history have been ones that the government didn't focus on, which is why there's an author who talks about India growing at night, because that is when the government is not awake, and
Yeah.
that's when people are allowed to grow.
Mm.
So picking industries is not often a good idea because we pick the wrong industries. We pick the shiny industries which we like. Today, that's the chip industry. Every country wants a chip manufacturer. It's horrendously expensive. And it's the equivalent of the white elephants we created in the past. I would not think that's what a poor developing country should focus on. But what we are arguing is twofold. One, we have to focus on the basics in this new world, and the basics typically revolve around improving the quality of human capital. Because if there's anything that is going to stand you in good stead going forward, it is human capital. Yes, we need physical infrastructure. Yes, we need financial capital. But if you don't have human capital, you haven't got to base one. So you need to improve the quality of human capital. The second is that there are areas which are non-obvious simply because we've become so fascinated by the export-led manufacturing growth model that we think that's the only way. And in fact, because of the reasons I just suggested, we need to think of alternative pathways to growth. And that is why what we're saying is, think about services, not just direct services, but services embedded in manufacturing. Both those could be very good for exports, but also think of the whole range of services that your own domestic population needs, which could employ a lot of moderately skilled people. Let me give you an example of each. Direct services today, and I'm sure this is as true of South Africa as of India, you have highly qualified people in the country who are capable of, say, working as consultants across the world, MBAs from your universities. Now, there is no reason today that you should be in the country where you're providing services. We learned during the pandemic that you could provide consulting services from Chicago to Seattle. Well, why can't that be Cape Town to Seattle or Bangalore to Seattle? And in fact, that's what a whole number of consulting firms are doing. They are creating a global workforce, which is capable now of not just providing back office services, but front office services. That is actually providing the final presentation to clients, not just shaping up the PowerPoints for people in the West. So that's one, that direct services are possible. Think telemedicine, think there's a whole bunch of services we could go down. The second is that a lot of value added in even manufacturing consists of services embedded in manufacturing. Richard Baldwin has popularized the smile curve, where he talks about every stage of the production process and says, the most valuable stages are not the manufacturing, which is sort of the middle of the production process. In the iPhone, think of it as being produced by Foxconn. There's not that much value added there. Foxconn's value is market value is about 50 billion, even though it manufactures everything for Apple. Apple's market value on a good day is 3 trillion. Why? Because Apple owns the early part of the production chain, the intellectual property, the design, the ideas that go into the cell phone. And it also owns the last part of the production chain as you bring content into the iPhone, the iTunes, the fees it gets from the App Store, as well as the marketing and finance that go into the final product that is sold in those fancy Apple shops across the world. So when you own these services that are embedded in the manufactured iPhone product, you get a lot of the value. The manufacturing itself is a small fraction of that value. So, indirect services or services embedded in manufacturing is also very important. But then people say, who's going to create the jobs? This is all very well for the software programmers and the designers. But what about the ordinary, moderately educated person? Well, services can provide an enormous number of such jobs, ranging from, we need sanitation services in cities, we need retail services in cities, we need healthcare. Now, healthcare in many poor countries can be provided not just by the doctor. There are very few doctors relative to the population. But there could be a first line, which is the equivalent of the Chinese barefoot doctor. In India, this is usually a person who used to be a pharmacist or somebody who mixed together medicines in a store, who now calls himself a doctor. If you could train these people up to recognize 20 basic diseases, they could be the first line of contact for the public. The second line would be a real doctor who sort of can then diagnose a little further. Of course, the third line would be hospitals. But there's so much scope for jobs in the services area, we shouldn't dismiss it. This is not to say neglect manufacturing, but don't pour enormous subsidies into manufacturing, unlike what countries like India are doing today, in order to create that export-led growth. That path may be much harder today and may not lead to that, those glory days that happened to China or to Taiwan or to Korea.
So I was asking, do you get the sort of externalities, the benefits of manufacturing that you've seen in Thailand, Malaysia, and China, all those places in terms of firms as well as workers being able to work very hard for a period of time and then go out and do something else? Is it the same with services? Because it seems to be a bit different.
Why not? The same learning by doing in a manufacturing firm you get in a services firm. You could think of people joining hospitals and then branching off as Medicare people on their own. You can think of people joining universities and then going out to teach in smaller colleges or in schools that they set up. There is no reason to believe, yes, manufacturing can get much greater scale than services. That is true, though we are now seeing gigantic service firms like Accenture across the globe. But there is no reason why services cannot provide similar sort of learning by doing, especially if you invite international competition into your home. So one of the sort of fastest growing areas in India is what are called global capability centers, which are centers set up by multinationals to do R&D, to do design, to do research. Goldman Sachs' biggest office outside of New York is in Bangalore, where they have people building trading models, risk management models, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're getting is the knowledge transfer, which is one of the biggest sort of benefits of manufacturing foreign direct investment. And you're getting it in services now, not just in manufacturing. So I think the principles are similar. I think the details may differ, but the bottom line is not so much should you have manufacturing or services. You'd want to have both if you can. The problem is manufacturing may offer far less of the kind of avenue it offered Taiwan and South Korea. If we were in 1980, I would say go for it to India. But we are in 2024. And I would say the pathway is much narrower at this point, especially given every country has its own dose of manufacturing fetishism, where it doesn't want to see its manufacturing sort of being displaced by other countries, sometimes for good reason, because these are strategic industries, but often everything is called strategic. And that becomes the basis for protectionism.
So would it be fair to say, in a way, it's carry on with low skill manufacturing where you can, because you can get people into those jobs, low skill jobs, very quickly, coming from rural areas, or they haven't had an opportunity for a decent education. But fix your education system as fast as you can so you can get people into what tend to be more higher skill services jobs. The what examples, or is that wrong? Would that be a
I, I,
thing?
I, I'd say the second part is absolutely right, that you need to fix your education, and you can't keep saying it's going to take 20 years. 20 years starts now. So in fact, it should have started 10 years ago. You have to do it, and now is the best time to do it. And you have to do it whether you go into manufacturing or services, because the robots are coming, the protectionism is coming, the AI is coming. We don't know how much it's going to affect every sector, but your only sort of protection against all that is human capital. That firms must want to
Mm.
hire the workers that you have. The people that you have should be capable of starting new enterprises, of innovating, etc. That's the only way you're going to reliably grow. So that's important. On the low skill manufacturing, I think it has been an excuse for a number of countries to do very little on improving the quality of their human capital. Oh, yes, they will get jobs, low skill jobs. Well, there's only a limited number of those jobs. And eventually, it's very hard to do far more without running up against low skill competition from elsewhere, where they've done a little better in improving the quality of the infrastructure. They've been a little harsher on their workers, and give them much less time off, run greater sweatshops, and you're uncompetitive as soon as you go up against that kind of competition. So I would say yes, we need jobs wherever we can get them. But you need to understand that it's a two-way process. One, we need to create jobs for the skills that people have. And if they're not happening in low-skill manufacturing, think about low or moderately skilled services, which is a very neglected area. Many of our cities are, I don't know what the experience in South Africa is, but finding a good plumber in an Indian city is impossible, because we haven't trained people up to deal with the modern sanitary ware in the numbers that we need. That's much less difficult than keeping on saying we need low skill manufacturing to employ these workers. We need plumbers, electricians, um, you know machine repair guys. Lots more can be employed
Mm.
under current circumstances. So that's important to remember. But also important to remember is that once you can create whatever sort of last mile skilling there is, there's also the long term skilling needs, which is what is the 5, 10, 15-year project, and that we're neglecting tremendously. A lot of countries, including, I imagine, South Africa, are dreaming of when they become a fully developed country with high levels of per capita income and very little inequality. But that requires elevating the bottom of the pyramid tremendously.
Mm.
And that requires investing in them today, because at the bottom of the pyramid, there's malnutrition, there's poor childcare, there is very bad sort of education right from the beginning. What do you get at the end? You get people who cannot compete in the global economy. How many of such people can a first world economy sustain? And if those people exist in large numbers today, they're going to be there 20 years from now, because they're the workforce 20 years from now. And so unless you fix it today, there is very little hope of reaching developed country status. Forget all the other elements of developed country status, which is an aging population, et cetera, et cetera. If the youngest part of the population is the least competent because it hasn't had the healthcare, the education, et cetera, there is no way you can become developed. And this is what I keep trying to tell my Indian sort of compatriots: stop talking about development without fixing the problems today.
Great. Well, that's a good maxim on which to move to another topic. You mentioned protectionism, and most people don't talk about some of the elements of protectionism that you have mentioned in the past. For example, the US imposes minimum wages on car workers in Mexico, or India now you have to have a license to import computers. So you have said that rather than pushing for a better form of globalization in which past mistakes are addressed, too many of today's elite are willing to hedge it with enough caveats that it becomes rank protectionism. Talk to us about this from a developing country perspective. Why do you say that?
Well, by the way, on the Indian computer restrictions, licensing, that was, again, incomprehensible policy, where you were trying to favor manufacturing by killing one of your most successful export industries, which was, software services. So I think sometimes we really need to think these things through. Fortunately, that policy has been withdrawn and consigned to the rubbish heap, where it deservedly belongs. On the issue of protectionism, I think we've all heard lectures for many years. Certainly, I did when I was growing up, about how open markets were a great thing and how wonderful it was that it helped the West grow from the post-war sort of malaise. And every country was urged to open up its economy. And, I remember lectures from the IMF, the World Bank, etc., to India. That was actually not bad advice, but it neglected the fact that there were sufferers from this, and we had to do a far better job at helping those who were hurt. Now, what we see is the same problems afflict developed countries, right? There's this enormous number of papers on the China shock talking about how manufacturing towns in the US sort of found manufacturing fleeing and inherited social problems, family breakdown, etc., as economic activity ceased. And it's blamed on China. And it's therefore an excuse for saying, no, we can't, this globalization is an elite project, and we can't have it here, without talking about the fact that the real problem is you did nothing about the workers who were endangered. You should have been constantly focusing on how you could retrain them, upskill them, provide trade adjustment, which is a program which the US has never done well. There are countries that have done it well, the Scandinavian countries, for example, constantly looking at the kinds of skills training that their workers need and saying, like, going against globalization is not an option for a small country like us. We have to essentially ride its waves. So what is hypocritical is the same economists who preached open markets to the developing world, knowing fully well that there were going to be losers, and in the developing world, those losers were never helped. There are papers on this before the very prominent papers on the China shock, showing the shocks in developing countries. But nobody came to their rescue saying, we should stop this kind of globalization. And, perhaps it was good for the countries they globalized, but it was very bad for the people who were hurt. And now what we see is the people who are hurt have a much bigger voice because they're raising their voice in democratic countries. And there are movements to support them, anti-globalization movements. Both parties in the US today are effectively anti-globalization. So my sense is economists have to be fairer about this. And not every time their own societies feel pain, when the pain comes home, to immediately say, oh, we must stop this, not recognizing that a lot of the rest of the world benefits from this. And you benefited from globalization when you had efficient firms, and you were spreading your selling across the world. You can't, when the tables are turned on you, close the game down and say, I'm not playing anymore. That, to my mind, seems to be the deficiency in the attitude of industrial country economists who suddenly have rediscovered the value of protectionism or now hedge all free trade with enormous caveats. Oh, no, no, not if it's a strategic opponent who's doing this, or not if they subsidize this or that. Every country subsidizes. The question is, who subsidizes more, and that can be sort of calculated. It doesn't have to be just based on finger pointing.
Great. Let me touch on industrial policy quickly. You mentioned it earlier, but you've said that the new elite project is industrial policy aimed at creating national champions. What's wrong with that, in your view?
Nothing wrong if the national champions become national champions by competition, not just domestic competition, but often international competition. Yes, I understand the infant industry argument. We got to protect these guys for a little while so that they can grow bigger. Sometimes there's merit to that. But all too often, as India has discovered in the past, the policies stay in place long after their past due date. We have to protect them because they're infants, and they stay infants for 30, 40 years. I mean, that's no infancy, that is adulthood, but preying on the population with enormous prices. And this is what I fear with the national champions. These are already large firms that are very influential in policy and get the kind of protection that allow them to be inefficient and preying on domestic citizens with high prices for a long, long time. Countries like Korea had the right intention, where they said, okay, we'll sort of protect for a little while, but then these companies have to compete in global markets and become globally competitive. But they are recognizing the fact that these national champions now dominate the domestic economy also, and there is a lot more oligopoly or monopoly than they would want. And they are at this point having that debate about how much they should allow competition in an environment where it's very hard to allow it, because the big players who also have enormous political clout are dominating the local economy. But nevertheless, South Korea is a problem many countries would like to have because it's a developed country. It liberalized at the right time. Many countries will not liberalize. And as a result, they become countries like Mexico, where it's it's the middle income trap, where you're dominated by a few sort of very, very influential companies. And that's why I think, having national champions is a double-edged sword. If you've protected them to make them national and champions, they have enormous domestic power and are very unwilling to relinquish it. That means domestic citizens get bad service at high prices. So I would rather that we don't go down that route, that we create a good business environment domestically so that many can compete, including foreign firms, and that, where necessary, a little bit of aid is not necessarily a bad thing, but bureaucrats are very bad at choosing the sectors to offer aid. Instead, I would do that as a matter of broad, if we are trying to say subsidize job creation, offer a little more in terms of credit to entities that can say they're creating more jobs. But I'd make it very mild and as competitive as possible. Choose as little about who's going to be the winner. Make it available to all. Don't say only large firms or only small firms. Just make it across the board so that you don't create an unlevel playing field.
Great. Let me change the subject. India's just had a remarkable election, and I know that democracy is an issue that you think about a lot. In your view, what does the election tell us about democracy and its possible advantages over a more authoritarian government? Is democracy good for economic growth and development?
I think the answer uh, as with all economic answers, maybe it depends. But I would say democracy is very good for India today. And the reason I say that is India is in the ranks of the lower middle income countries. But in where it wants to go, if it wants to go to frontier industries, there are a bunch of reasons democracy can be very helpful. First, democracy tells you when you're going off track. And that's what this election revealed. The government refused to acknowledge that there was a jobs problem in India.
Hmm.
And I think one of the big lessons from this election, of course, there are many complicated lessons, is that people are worried about their future, even though you're growing at 7 and 8%. It's relatively jobless growth, and so people want those jobs, and you're seeing a divide, especially amongst the lower middle class, about the direction of the country. And I think democracy through elections tells you that. Now, democracy is, of course, more than elections. The fact that Mr. Modi no longer has a majority in parliament, has to work with coalition partners, also implies that more broadly, the other institutions of democracy feel bolder. The press, for example, the you know the opposition can speak more loudly, and it's heard and carried by the press. The judiciary feels more confident in going against the government in terms of its decisions. I think having the possibility of someone else coming into power offers you a stronger backbone. That's very, very important in a democracy. You have illiberal democracies. The possibility of a change in power is very important to make it more liberal. So one is you get to know what's going wrong, and you can't suppress bad news. And that actually is good for the government because it allows it to alter policies. We saw that in the recent budget, where the
Hmm.
government, for the first time, suggested a bunch of policies to enhance job creation. So that's one. The second, I think, is bottom up. People feel more empowered to protest. When you've got bad public services, when you've got an awful, healthcare system, awful education, people need the conviction that if they protest, they won't be put in jail. That's what democracy allows. So I think the bottom-up protest process is also important. The third is creativity. That as you get closer to the frontiers, you're going to be able to really produce innovation if you have people who are willing to challenge. And challenge can't be restricted only to challenging scientific ideas. It also comes to challenging political ideas. Openness is broad-based, not very narrowly focused. And you can see that in places where you're not allowed to challenge political ideas, sometimes scientific ideas also become hard to challenge because Herr Doctor Professor cannot be contradicted. So hierarchies tend to perpetuate themselves both in authoritarian countries, not just in the administration, but also in universities and so on. And lastly, in this world where you're trying to sell services, for example, trust is very important. If I'm getting your medical data to offer you telemedicine, you must be very confident that I'm not going to use it to blackmail you. And that requires trust about institutions in the country. Trust not just about the companies, but also that the government in the country cannot probe into the companies and siphon off the data, which it then uses for its own practices elsewhere. So I think for all these reasons, I said earlier, maybe democracy may have held India back in terms of its early growth. But democracy certainly can be very, very helpful in its future growth. And this would be the absolute wrong time to abandon it. And that's why my book with Rohit Lamba, written before the election, was pushing very hard for a much more democratic outcome.
Hmm.
And I'm glad that that's what happened.
Hmm. Great. I want to cover two of your books, two more books that you've written. Perhaps best to go to the book you wrote in 2019 on the third pillar, which was it's about how states and markets are leaving communities behind, , which is very important for democracy. So This is an unusual topic for a macroeconomist. What were you, what's the essential argument? What are you trying to push into the public arena? What really concerned you about this?
Well, it's a little bit what was happening in the developed world, right? That the rise of the Brexit, followed by the rise of Trump. I think these were in part reactions to a sense of malaise that we're not as good as we were before in the developed world, and we have vast areas which are just unable to compete in the global economy. The towns, for example, where manufacturing left, and what I was starting with was the premise that yes, that is in fact right. And what industrial countries have is a problem of underdevelopment, not at the aggregate sort of macroeconomic level, but at the local level. There are vast areas in a developed country which wouldn't look out of place in a third world country. And they are the ghettos in big American cities. They're the manufacturing towns that have seen economic activity disappear. They're the banlieue in Paris. They're the northern towns in the United Kingdom. And what I was saying is that, look, essentially what we need to think about is not so much macro fiscal policy or monetary policy here. It is about development policy. And we really don't know how to do development well. But the advantage many of these fallen behind communities have is that they exist within a rich country. And what is important is to reconnect them to the rich country while ensuring that the people within those communities can sort of strengthen their own human capital so as to compete in the rich country. And what is in a sense what had weakened was the third pillar. The first pillar being the markets, the economy more broadly speaking, the second pillar being the government and government agencies at the central level. The third pillar is the community and local government. And I was trying to say that, in many ways, the local community and local government have become disempowered. They've lost economic activity, and they basically have lost connection to the national economy. And so what is important is community revival, bottom up rather than top down. This is not about the state basically saying, thou shalt do this or thou shalt do that, but enabling these communities to pick themselves up, a building up or a leveling up strategy, but which has far more willingness to trust the local community. Mm. And of course, part of the problem is that historically we've been unwilling to trust the local community. They will drink it away, or they will be corrupt, or they will, in the US, this is a favorite, they will start teaching creationism if you let them have any control over education. And the answer is yes, mistakes are always possible, bad actions are always possible. But the benefit today of localization is you have both a bottom-up control, in the sense that people have much better information about what's going on locally. And you have top-down light control, which is the center can always lightly monitor what's happening to funds, what's happening. And you have examples, for example, in Uganda, of funds being sent from the center to local schools, and the local people knowing that it didn't show up in any kind of spending that would favor them, and thereby monitoring and pushing their local teachers and so on to spend it better. So I think it's time to give this another go. And the strengthening the third level, not just in the West, it's a big factor in the book on India, that India could benefit from far more decentralization. The example of China and its local officials. India's biggest state is 240 million people. That's, I think the fifth largest country in the world.
Wow.
So that's all governed from the center because the third level of government has been relatively weak for a long time. So what this is saying is decentralize, fund, trust, but also allow for local leadership to emerge. I think there are greater possibilities of that. There's greater possibility of local activity because of work at a distance, but there's work to do here. And so the third pillar was about, this may be a way by which we can have our cake and eat it too, have um, have the benefits of a market economy, but have a strong local community also. Not
Mm.
exclusive. That's why I call it inclusive localism. Empowered, but accepting. And this is hard, but it seems like the way forward when you look at successful communities across the world.
So just to push back, it's such an interesting idea and relevant to South Africa, certainly. But so you're in favor of the devolution of powers to local communities, local authorities, but you also say that when inclusion goes up against localism, inclusion should win out. What
Yeah.
what what do you mean by that?
Well, first, I mean, the principle to keep in mind is what one calls subsidiarity in the Roman Catholic religion. Push powers down to the lowest level where they can be exercised effectively, right? So don't hold them at a higher level than you need to. One example is Switzerland, where primary schools are really the responsibility of the local village. The high schools are the responsibility of the canton, while the technology universities are the responsibility of the federal government. So push powers down as far as you can. That gives people a sense of empowerment, a sense of sort of control over their futures. At the same time, what you don't want is every local community erecting high walls around it and saying nobody but us. And then what you'll get is divisiveness with the richest communities building the highest walls, even while benefiting from all that, national cohesiveness and security brings them. So you want small walls, walls that define what the boundaries of the community are, that allow, a sense of identity to build up, a sense of mutual self-help to build up, because there are many things a community can do that a government or a market cannot. But at the same time, you don't want it to be so high that you lose the benefits of being in a larger economy, in a larger country, right? And so, what is the appropriate level to set it at, where it is porous, but it is visible? It's visible because it gives us a sense of identity. It's porous because goods and services can go across it. You don't say only stuff that's made here should be sold here. That becomes a monopoly, which is difficult for the local citizens. But if you say, hey, we're going to come together we're going to have a football team and we're going to compete against the next community. Knowing where the wall of the community is allows you to know who's in the football team, gives you more of a sense of identity. So that's the sense. Again, this is not the easiest thing to practice,
Mm.
but I think we need that. You can't have exclusive communities. That's the breakdown of society. But you can't have communities without any boundary, because that is the facelessness, the citizen of everywhere who then becomes a citizen of nowhere.
Mm. Great. We've got a bit more time, and I want to end with your other book, or a very famous other book that you wrote, which has a wonderful title, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. Um, what is your essential argument? And this was about 20 years ago. And do you hold to that argument today? How do you see it today? What did you mean? And how are we doing?
Well, we talked about it a little earlier, which was when we talked about national champions. And I was Luigi Zingales and I wrote this book in the early 2000s, basically worried that you know as countries sort of favored national champions, they tended to create rules and regulations that hurt their own people. A business-friendly government is what we were against. A government that is for free enterprise is what we are for. We are for competition. We are for creating a enabling business environment. We are not for picking winners and losers and picking friends and relatives to succeed. That is the death knell of any democratic society. Now, interestingly, Karl Marx, famous, of course, and George Stigler, perhaps less famous, but a proponent of the free market view of the University of Chicago, came to basically the same conclusion. Government and business are in bed with each other. But their solutions were different. Karl Marx was eliminate business, and George Stigler was eliminate government. I think they have to live with each other, but you have to make it such that they're not in bed with each other. And how do you create a society? So that's where the saving capitalism from the capitalists. How do you create a free market system, which we're not against safety nets. We're not against, in fact, the book emphasizes the importance of safety nets in preventing the reaction against capitalism. We're not against government doing what is necessary before age 20, 25 in helping people acquire the skills that they need. But we're saying that beyond that, what its focus should be on is creating a competitive environment, not in favoring A or B. And this is where we thought globalization was a really good thing, because it allowed competition from outside to keep the tendency of local champions to sort of monopolize the local economy in check. And so open markets, broadly speaking, was not a bad thing. It helped in the larger scheme of things. Now, of course, everyone has their favorite example of how government intervention created a country. South Korea is everybody's favorite example. And I have no problem with that. I just say that it's very special for a country to protect and then loosen the protections. And almost always it never loosens fully, because you've got the capitalists inside of a size who want to prevent competition. And that's the problem that South Korea is grappling with, of course, with a much higher level of income than most other countries. So it's a problem, as I said earlier, that everybody would love to have, but it is still a problem. And they're the exception.
Well, this has been a fantastic hour. Raghu, thank you very much for covering such a wide field with me and giving everybody a flavor of the depth of thinking and ideas that come out of the University of Chicago and yourself that are so special and unusual. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks everybody for joining us. This has
Thank
been
you.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for all the nice questions. It allowed for a lively response. Thanks very much,
Good.
and good night. Good night to all of you.
Great. Thanks very much. Yes, good day to you and good night to our audience. Raghu,
Thanks
that was
again, and
fabulous. Yeah, thank you so much.
of
And
course.
we'll send you the write-up, which we'll publish soon.
Okay, great. Talk to you
Excellent.
soon.
Great.
Bye.
Great to reconnect. Thank you.